And hello, welcome. My name is Steve Hewitt. I'm in the Department of History at the University of Birmingham. I run this tiny little YouTube channel called Terrorizing History. I think this is a highlight of 2023. I average about one of these interviews per year, and we have a great guest today for 2023, which will get us through. We're also, as ever, given our low budget, having technical problems with freezing internet, multiple people tying up the very important broadband when I need it. So I apologize if there's any freezing, any delay, but I'm very pleased to have here today a guest who's written this book, which is called Gender, Religion, and Extremism, Finding Women in Anti-Radicalization. The author is Dr. Katherine Brown, who is a reader in religion and global security in the Department of Theology and Religion at the University of Birmingham, and she's joining us from a suburb of Birmingham here today. Welcome, Katherine. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here talking with you today.
And I think there's a bit of a delay, but we'll push ahead. So, Katherine, tell us about yourself. Tell us about your background. Tell us how you got interested in the topic, terrorism, political violence in the first place.
Yeah, for sure. So I was actually doing my PhD on women's rights in Islamic movements. So I was interested in how Islamic movements negotiated different ideas about women's rights. And I was doing field work in Egypt at the time. And while I was doing that field work, the women I was interviewing were basically saying that they're not very interesting, that they kind of worked within the system, the political system in Egypt, that they were happy kind of navigating and negotiating with the state. Now, this was under Hosni Mubarak, so quite some time ago, before the Arab Spring. But so what they then said, they said, you know what, the people you should talk to are the women at the mosque down the road. You should go and talk to those women because they have some really interesting things to say, and we don't agree with them, but we think you should go and listen to them. So I did. And it turns out that the women I ended up interviewing and talking to were women who belonged to early or nascent Salafi organizations in Egypt who rejected outright any engagement in formal politics, and in fact supported the use of violence in order to overthrow the state. And they were very vocal, over the moon that somebody cared about what they thought and did, and really quite clear in what they hoped to achieve in their agency and what they were looking for in terms of their rights, in terms of their participation, and what that meant for them. Now, at this point, I should say that my supervisor freaks out because I'm meant to be in Egypt doing some super safe things like interviewing well-known non-governmental organizations and women's movements. And there's me hanging out in less reputable parts of Cairo because I thought it would be interesting. Mm-hmm. So none of this ends up in my PhD because it was not to the question in mind and so on, but it was there. And my PhD was comparative. So I also interviewed women in the UK and in Malaysia. Once 7/7 happened here in the UK, the women that I'd interviewed in the UK turned around and said, we need to talk to you. We talked to you a couple of years ago. We need to talk to you again about our experiences belonging to women's organizations, to Islamic organizations under the new kind of counterterrorism regime and what's happening to our lives as a response to the 7/7 bombings. And so that's really what started it off, was kind of recognizing that I'd done this earlier work and going, oh yeah. And then the women that I previously interviewed for my PhD about rights, then coming to really try and talk to me about their new experiences with how they were engaging with the state and what the state discourse and actions and the police were behaving like towards them, and that they were really surprised and shocked by this because it was such a shift. And in fact, when I went back over my interviews for my PhD, for the same women, right, in the UK. They were
Mm.
really, really different in what they were saying about their hopes, about their engagement with the state, about their ideas about rights. And so much of it stemmed from their everyday experiences of the state in response to terrorist attacks. And so that really got me going and trying to think about, okay, what might the connection be between these two different groups of women who are experiencing state discrimination as a result of counterterrorism, and these other women who I'd interviewed who were actively fighting against the state and willing to use violence to try and change the system in Egypt. So yeah, it was that kind of comparative, and some of it's serendipity. I think much of academia is accidental. Not that we're allowed to admit that, right? We're meant to have these formalized accounts of why we do the research that we do, but some of it is, yeah, someone said I go talk to these people, so I did.
So just following on that, I mean, so how would you categorize your scholarship? I mean, I've often wondered about this about you. Are you a political scientist? Are you an international relations specialist? Are you a scholar of religion? Are you a terrorism studies academic?
Yeah, I don't fit neatly into any one kind of disciplinary background. I would usually characterize myself as someone
Academic. I mean, are you all of those things rolled together?
So if I was putting on a proper academic hat, I would say, oh, this talks to the debate between being transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary. So trying to work across boundaries or rejecting all of the boundaries. And I would say that I am primarily someone who's quite comfortable at home in pretty much any political science or IR department, but also in a religious studies department. What I'm not is I'm not a theologian.
Right.
So I'm interested in how people relate to religion, what they say about religion, what they say about their beliefs, and how they construct those and what that enables them to do or not do in their lives. But I'm not someone who's going to almost independently run through the doctrines or the theologies of particular faiths in order to construct a kind of moral framework for behavior or action. There are better qualified people than me to do that side of this type of work. So I think that's what's also really interesting about studying and researching organizations and individuals that participate in violence is how it forces us to question disciplinary binaries and disciplinary divides. And I think we've lost Steve for a bit, but I'm going to carry on anyway. Oh, you're back.
Keep going.
Keep going. Okay. So what I find really fascinating,
the joys of home internet.
Yeah. So what I find really fascinating is how we can assume a certain kind of methodological approach based on our academic backgrounds. But in practice, we find that the boundary, say, between religion and politics doesn't really exist. You really can't differentiate between what is politics and what is religion and vice versa, because they're so interwoven. And in fact, these categories are almost constructed by academics so that we can make ourselves feel a bit better about why we're in one department versus another. But what I would say is one of the reasons why I'm in a theology and religious studies department is because I find the content of religion fascinating. So that taking religion seriously and not just treating it as a variable. So I don't know about in history, but in political science and in international relations, it's often that religion is like a black box. And it's either a black box that kind of moves someone towards peace or towards violence, right? But it's just a black box. It's like you add this black box into your equation and there's an outcome, and it's presumed to be either a negative or positive influence. But one of the challenges with political science is that they very rarely open up that black box and really question about, well, how come in some cases you end up with violence and in other cases you don't? And to what extent is it a strong feature or not so strong? And to me, I think we have to open up that black box. The other box that I think is super interesting that we can also open up is the one around gender. So you'll notice that the book is called Gender, Religion, and
So
Extremism.
tell us about the book.
Oh, Steve, I can't hear the actual question. Sorry, I didn't get the question.
It's okay. So tell us about the book. Tell us about the focus of the book. Tell us about the main arguments in the book, which again, hold up a copy right there from Oxford University Press.
It is. It's an OUP Press. So it's Gender, Religion, and Extremism. And I suppose the arguments are relatively simple in that I'm really saying that gender is an organizing logic behind both terrorism and counterterrorism. And that as a result of this, we can't really understand either terrorism itself or counterterrorism without really unpacking the gender assumptions that work into it. So one of the things that I've looked at is this argument around chivalry and how chivalry might work both in relation to terrorist organizations, how they talk about being a hero and being kind of buying into a chivalric world order, kind of a medieval type understanding of it. But also we find chivalry operating in counterterrorism discourses as well. This idea of being the great protector and having to protect society, but also themselves from this external kind of deviant masculinity in the form of Islamic extremist men. So we have that, we have these similar masculinities actually working on both sides. And that can be quite uncomfortable because no one wants to think of themselves as having similar qualities or similar behaviors as people that we vilify for their violence, such as terrorists, right? So if you're then telling counterterrorism officials, oh, by the way, you know, you actually use the same kind of masculine discourses as the violent extremist groups do, that doesn't always work so well from, like, it's not always well received, shall we say, but it is very much there. And the consequence of this is that actually counterterrorism discourses and practices, so it's not just what people, counterterrorism officials say, it's also what they do, reinforces gender hierarchies, both for the societies in which they're operating, but also to their target communities. So in that sense, it's also reinforcing certain ideas about patriarchy more widely. So that's the argument.
Have you made those points to people that work in counterterrorism? And if so, what's been their response?
Yeah, unofficially, yes. So myself and indeed some others that I've worked with have over the years kind of commented about how counterterrorism is often a man's club, right? So often, in fact, 9 times out of 10, the people who directly engage in counterterrorism, say, as opposed to countering violent extremism, men, they're often assuming that they're working with or against other men, and that in doing so, they reinforce particular ideas. And some of the counterterrorism officials I've spoken to about this are okay with it. They turn around and say, well, yes, but statistically speaking, the majority of the world's terrorists are men. And we happen to come from this kind of securitized policing or militarized background, which is also predominantly men. It's just the way things are. And they're not even defensive of it. They just see it as a normal state of affairs and not even something worth critiquing. Others, and especially since ISIS, have been a bit more aware that not paying attention to gender can be detrimental to their overall effectiveness and who they're looking out for. But when it then comes to their own self-reflection, the response that I often get is this idea that, oh no, I take a gender blind approach. Right. So they would say to me, I just treat the person in front of me. I don't care what gender they are. I just look at them and say, okay, these are their vulnerabilities. These are their needs. How can I support them? Say, for example, in countering violent extremism or in the policing where, well, they're just like, oh yeah, this is just a suspect. And it's a gender neutral term. And they say, so I'm gender blind, and they treat that as meaning they don't have to worry about gender anymore because they don't see gender. But that in itself can be problematic because it might actually stop them from thinking about their own performance, about how are they as men kind of putting on a sense of security, but also in doing so, potentially undermining the security of others, and perhaps also limiting the kind of information that they actually want.
I thought one of the strengths of the book is there's a tendency, not so much among academics, but certainly among and doesn't apply to men, and that gender is a two-way street. And I thought you do a good job of pointing out, just as you've done in the comment now, about how not just women.
Yeah. So in a way, the title of the book being Gender, Religion and Extremism was deliberate, but the next part, the subtitle of it, was Finding Women in Anti-Radicalization. And there is a tension there in the title. I won't, try and hide from that. But I think what's important is not only that we need to consider gender as important to men, but also that it's relational. So the logics that I point to in the book, so I talk about chivalry, I talk about becoming a father and fatherhood as an ideal, but those only make sense because we also have the constructs of femininity, of motherhood operating alongside it. And similarly, ideas of pacifism for women in contrast with the assumptions of violence of men, right? So yes, we need to bring in men into the conversation and masculinities into research and practice on gender, but always mindful that it only makes sense in relation to femininities and feminine identities and discourses around that. Otherwise, they kind of just, they don't really make sense in the world.
One of the things that struck me about the book, especially in the conclusion to it, but earlier as well, I mean, do you see anti-radicalization as having any useful purpose at all, that these programs? I mean, is it a fool's errand? I mean, you point out at the end that there's not even agreed definitions of the concepts. There are, I mean, as a historian, I have to say I'm skeptical of these concepts and these broad, sort of theoretical frameworks that can be put down anywhere. But I mean, I know you do propose that a sort of feminist approach, which I thought in many ways was about improving wider society, if anything, in terms of equality and things such as that. But do you think there is any point to these programs? Do they serve any useful purpose at all?
Yeah.
I mean, you did look, I should add, you did look at a number of countries. I mean, I think it's 5 countries that you compare in the book, and obviously very different countries and very different approaches, although obviously with commonalities that you point out, especially when it comes to gender. But did you see anything that?
Oh, yes. So I want to give you a politician's answer, which is yes and no. And third, I wouldn't start from here. So I'm similarly quite skeptical of these programs, especially countering violent extremism and preventing violent extremism programs, because I think that they can reinforce certain ideas about security that in the long run undermine women's security. And they do so because they reinforce ideas about where the threat comes from. And they prioritize this idea of a particular threat coming from a particular class of men, regardless of the empirical basis for that. And they present the state as the savior, as the hero in all of this. And the challenge there is that actually the state is very rarely the hero, and is often complicit in much of the violence that we see around the world, and indeed is complicit in the violence against women across the world. So the idea that we can rely on the state to somehow provide for the security of, in particular, women, but generally all peoples, would be problematic if we just take it at face value, especially then when we see the gender differential impacts. So there are harms that are carried out in the name of countering terrorism that specifically impact on women in gendered ways, and that they're often overlooked and ignored, and we're told to kind of like suck it up in the name of greater security. So it reminds me actually of Cynthia Enlow's work, where she was talking about revolutions, and she opens one of her books, I think it's Does Khaki Become You? And the book opens with this idea that after the revolution, Esmeralda would have her IUD removed, so her contraceptive implant removed, right? Because during the revolution, she had to kind of give up on these ideas of motherhood, but once the revolution was over, she could carry on in that kind of gender stereotypical way. And I think countering violent extremism programs can end up reinforcing these gender ideas and don't always reflect the security needs of women in communities. Having said all of that, and this is why this is a politician's answer, I do think that there are benefits from moving away from a purely kinetic response that is a purely militarized or hyper-securitized response to violent extremism and terrorism. I think that one of the strengths of looking at countering violent extremism and preventing violent extremism programs is that they can result in a wider societal discourse that allows us to rethink what it is to be secure in a society. What is it that we want from it? And it holds us all accountable. Now, that question of accountability can work both ways. So I see that question of accountability as someone who is relatively privileged. So I'm English speaking, I'm white, I'm middle class, I'm well educated. And that means that accountability, that responsibility is a burden that I should be taking on. And I think that can help us really think about why it is that tragically some people think that violent extremism is the solution to their problems. What is it about our societies and our own behaviors that is leading them towards that? Of course, there's always the caveat that accountability, that responsibilization at the moment tends to disproportionately fall on the people least able to actually do something about it. So it often ends up being a burden placed on disadvantaged, impoverished, marginalized communities. And they're told they've got to be responsible for kind of solving this problem. And there's the rub there as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things, and again, just following on that point, I was surprised that you wrote on page 202, anti-radicalization efforts are not necessarily better than hard measures of kinetic counterterrorism approaches because they rely on the same masculinist productive. Have you heard it?
I did not hear any of that quote from my
sorry.
own writing because it really broke up. Basically, remind me again, what did I say on page 202?
Yeah, so it falls on a point you just made. You wrote on page 202 that anti-radicalization efforts are not necessarily better than hard measures of kinetic counterterrorism approaches because they rely on the same masculinist, protectionist logic and violence.
Yeah, in short. And so I think that again points to the potential within countering violent extremism programs to move away from those logics. But when we see them in practice, they don't. When we see them, whether that's in the United Kingdom, whether it's in Indonesia, whether it's in Saudi Arabia or in Netherlands, we see in practice a certain kind of logic about protection that is also about control. So more recently, I've also written about how countries are responding to returnees. So people who have traveled out to Iraq and Syria and are looking to return home. And in interviewing practitioners there, what I've uncovered is this kind of mechanism to care, a genuine kind of desire to care, but that comes with a desire to control, right? Because of this protectionist logic. And we see that in countering violent extremism programs as well. There is a desire to care, and that's caring for and caring about the communities that they're working with or the individuals that they're working with. But it's also comes with it this idea of to care for as in to control for. And that comes from that protectionist logic that the state and countering violent extremism practitioners end up wanting to really try and control and manage risk, and that comes with its costs. And some of those can be violent.
I mean, some of that plays out in the case of Shamima Begum, who you write about late in the book as well. I mean, that is obviously a contemporary ongoing case, but again, how gender comes into play in terms of her behavior and her responses, which some of it, as you point out, might have been PTSD, but was taken through a very harsh kind of gendered lens in terms of her not being grateful and not showing proper due deference to the West, and all those sorts of narratives playing out, and her as effectively being demonized by the British press.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's important there is how there's also a racialized dynamic, right? So the treatment of Shamima Begum and others who are not white is very different to those who are white in this. And that's not just about whether it's the far right. So it's not just about ideology, right? So you might be assuming, oh, well, this is because how exit programs have worked against the far right. And we have a long history of those, say in Germany, but also Norway and Scandinavia, and to some extent in the UK and the US and Canada, that's white populations and they're the white majority. So they're going to treat this problem differently to how we might treat a presumed foreign or external threat in the form of Islamist extremism. But actually, that doesn't, empirically, it doesn't hold, because the assumption that Islamist extremism is foreign and external is highly problematic and reinforces some very racist stereotypes about Islam not being European, or which is really problematic and ignoring European history to a large degree. But also, when you contrast the treatment of reverts or converts who have also joined extremist Islamist organizations, and their treatment as white women who joined Islamist violent extremist organizations such as ISIS, they're not vilified in quite the same way. In fact, what's really interesting is how they are given a form of agency and sometimes even like a superpower status. Like, think about Samantha Laithwaite, who has somehow gone from being, an ordinary young woman or slightly older woman, to being the evil genius mastermind who has somehow foiled the security services across the entire continent of Africa and created these horrific attacks. And so she gets given a very different treatment. And it's an oddly kind of reverse hero worship, in a way, right? She's given all of the status and all of this agency, and she's given this kind of geniusness. Whereas Shamima Begum and others who like her are either treated as imbeciles, so they were duped, they were groomed is the language that's often used, and in doing so they succumbed to their emotions, to love, right? It couldn't possibly be rational and political, but also that they failed to duly take note of the liberal goods of Western society. So it was a double betrayal, right? They betrayed certain ideas about femininity, but they also betrayed the West, or the stereotype of the West, which meant that you can't put them in this kind of same hero worshipping, reverse hero worship camp as we did with Samantha Laithwaite.
Yeah. So we're recording this on the 9th of February, 2023. It's the day after the Shawcross review of Prevent was released. How would your analysis in this book react to that? I realize you probably haven't had a chance to read the review, but you've probably seen some of the media coverage of it. I mean, do you think it's in a sense back to the future, that we're going backwards in time rather than moving forward.
Yeah, so I think there's some really interesting points from the Shawcross review. So one of the things that I've actually railed against for quite some time is actually the medicalization of terrorism. I've been quite skeptical of the dependency or the increasing dependency on psychiatry or neurosciences and psychology in isolation to explain away violence and terrorism. I think that harps back to the idea that somehow terrorists are insane or they're mad. So I cautiously welcome his kind of critique of that medicalization of terrorism and a desire to kind of bring back in questions of politics, of grievances, and of ideology.
Yeah.
My worry is that actually he's done that, but not taken on board those wider points, right? He's just gone back and said, oh, it's all about ideology. And it's like, well, no, that's not really what we're saying. When we've critiqued the individualization and the medicalization that radicalization as a concept has done, it's depoliticized terrorism. Because once you start focusing on the individual as your method, actually you stop asking the question, well, why does the group exist? Why is the organization there if all you're concerned about is why does the one individual join that organization?
Yeah.
But what he's then gone and done and said, oh no, this is just taking us back to the question of ideology, and we've got to focus back on that, and we've got to get back to that. And again, that misses the wider issue of, well, why does the group exist? Why does the ideology exist? And that does have something to do with psychology, but it's also got a lot to do with context, and it's got a lot to do with history, with injustices, with inequalities, and we can't ignore those. And I feel like they have been written out of the Shawcross review, like that broader reflection on why it was important to think about how communities work and why it's important to think about ideology in response to context. And but that's kind of just been kind of taken out. It's almost like he's gone from one extreme to the other.
And obviously one of the other criticisms, and I'd be curious actually how your book would look at the treatment of the far right through some of these programs. I mean, do you think similar sort of gendered issues arise? I mean, they must to a certain extent, but possibly not in the exact same form because you don't have necessarily the religious angle.
So I was lucky enough to write a second book with Emily Winterbotham and Elizabeth Pearson, which is a comparison of countering violent extremism programs that look at the far right as well as Islamist communities. And we did find a degree of similarity in the underlying logics. But one of the things that was really interesting was that whereas in the Muslim communities that we interviewed in, slightly frustratingly in 5 different countries to the book. So in that case, it was Canada, the UK, France, Germany. Oh, that'll be embarrassing. Liz will kill me for forgetting the 5th. Shoot. Oh, well. Anyway, the point being, it was a comparison looking at the far right and Muslim communities. What was really interesting was when we did focus groups and interviews within the community saying, what's your experience of counterterrorism? What's your experiencing of counter-violent extremism? It was really difficult to get white communities to acknowledge or think about far-right extremism as terrorism. And there was also much greater willingness to consider the idea that young men in particular might be vulnerable to far-right extremism, but that we could understand it and sympathize with it in a way that none of the Muslim communities felt able to say that about Islamist extremism. Not one of them said, we sympathize or we empathize with why the young men and women join violent extremist groups. None of them were going to go there. And that tells you a lot, right?
Yeah.
And in addition to that, in the Muslim community groups, they all had experience of countering violent extremism and CT activity. They were all well aware of what it meant for them and what it meant for their community and how they were engaging with it or why they were skeptical of it. And you contrast that with white community groups where they were like, oh yeah, but that's not really our problem. So I think that's some really quite telling, is that while the police and say the Prevent program in the UK officially might have been concerned with far right extremism, that certainly did not filter through to the communities that we interviewed.
Right. So one final question: what are you working on at the moment? What are your future projects?
Super. So at the moment, I am working on various projects to do with the repatriation, rehabilitation and reintegration of women and children who are returning from conflict zones, so Syria and Iraq primarily, but also Afghanistan, and looking at how those processes can be gender mainstreamed, and to look at the challenges to the existing programs, because they often rely on resources and assumptions that have been based on men's repatriation and rehabilitation, and assume certain things about women's experiences and their journeys that don't actually hold and not empirically accurate, but also the resources aren't there. Because many of these programs are institutionalized, they have funding, they're well equipped, but again, the majority of them are concerned with men. And that means they're not fit for purpose for women. And there's not enough resources out there. But the other part to that kind of research is what happens when we actually start to take seriously the rights of young men and men in this, and really look to the repatriation and the rehabilitation and reintegration of men currently trapped within Iraq and Syria, and why it is that actually at the moment, young boys are being treated as adult men and are being subject to extreme forms of violence within the internal displacement camps in the prisons in Iraq and Syria. They're being treated and potentially detained as adults, even though they're teenage boys. And they should. Why is it that we can't treat teenage boys in the same way that we do teenage girls? And there's an obvious kind of, because we're scared of young men are presumed to be risky, inherently violent, and we assume the girls are not. But actually those boys have been subject to extreme violence. They are victims, they're children, and we should be acknowledging their rights. But at the moment, especially boys on the threshold of adulthood, so if they're between the ages of 16, around the age of 16 onwards, then it's really, really difficult. But I think that we're going to have to face that reality, that we can't continue to traumatize young boys who may also be the victim of trafficking, of human trafficking, who have also suffered through no choices of their own. But our hyper-securitized fears and risk management says, oh no, we couldn't possibly respond to them. And so my research at the moment is trying to find ways around that, so that we can in fact look sensibly at the repatriation of young men.
Well, it's extremely important. Gender, religion, extremism, and the author is Katherine Brown. Thank you very much, Katherine.
My pleasure, Steve. It's really good to talk to you.
Thanks. Take care.
Will do.